think that's the way I started my first sermon I ever preached to you guys. But anyway, once upon a time, Abraham's nephew, Lot, was kidnapped. And now Lot was living in the city of Sodom by this time. He and Abram, his uncle, later named Abraham, had already parted ways, and Lot was living in Sodom. And it is that Sodom of the Sodom and Gomorrah infamy. But all of this happened years before that infamous tale of fire and brimstone. Years before that happened, the king of Sodom joined forces with this coalition of kings against another coalition of kings. They all wanted the power in the area for themselves, basically. And they had all gone out to war. And in the crossfire of this war, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are raided. And Lot ends up kidnapped, along with pretty much everyone else who lives in those cities and most of their goods and their livestock. Because, that's what happens when your army is forced to retreat into the hills, leaving your city defenseless. But someone does escape from all of this, and he runs not to the king, but to this wandering nomad named Abram, later again named Abraham, the father Abraham, who does not have any sons yet at this point in the story. In fact, his only living relative at this time, aside from his wife, so his only living blood relative, is Lot and Lot's family. So when he hears that Lot has been kidnapped, he gathers what is essentially his own private army, hundreds of fighting men born in his household, is what the text calls them. And he goes after Lot, and consequently, he goes after everyone else who was taken from Sodom, and he wins. Against this coalition of kings who had just forced the other coalition of kings into retreat, Abram, the wandering nomad, wins. He rescues everyone who was captured. He recovers everything that was stolen from Sodom and Gomorrah. And, I think one of the disservices we have done ourselves in recent times is forgetting this part of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Because that story, that infamous fire and brimstone judgment, does not actually begin with God's judgment in chapter 18 of Genesis. The story actually begins here in chapter 14 with this rescue story. The story begins with two kings leaving their own cities defenseless. And then Abraham, the man chosen by God, coming to their rescue. The beginning of the story here sets the tone for how it all ends, what the problem actually was, the pride of these kings trying to defeat each other, their reliance on their own wealth, both things that we see in the first Sodom and Gomorrah story, things that are carried through to its end. I think we've done ourselves a disservice by forgetting that Abraham, and by extension God, first saves Sodom and Gomorrah before any mention is made of judgment, long before fire and brimstone is brought. And we've certainly done Abraham a disservice here, because the most important part of this story is the end, which we read Bill read for us as part of our scripture readings for today. The end of this story, when the king of Sodom offers to pay Abraham back for what he has done. And Abraham refuses. And Abraham doesn't refuse out of politeness. And he doesn't refuse because he's just happy my nephew's safe or whatever. Abraham refuses to take any of the wealth of Sodom because he refuses to let Sodom have any claim on him. And this is significant because Abraham does, in fact, accept wealth and gifts and payment, etc., from other kings in the area. A lot of them, actually. He is already wealthy at this point in the story because of gifts from other kings, most notably the king of Egypt. His refusal here is specific to Sodom, because there is something about Sodom's wealth already here at the beginning of their story. Something about their wealth is already tainted. And this is, of course, the great contrast between Abraham and Lot. Why Lot ends his days as a refugee hiding up in the hills, while Abraham dies wealthy and respected and on good terms with all the kings around him. Lot chooses to live in Sodom. Even after this whole kidnapping thing, he goes back to Sodom. Lot is taken in by Sodom's wealth, while Abraham refuses it and keeps refusing it. But anyway, back to the story. Because in our story today, we're actually talking about another king. The king who shows up for literally 3 verses here in Genesis 14 and then just vanishes as suddenly as he appeared. So suddenly that the writer of Hebrews can later say he has no birth and no death, no family. He just appears out of thin air. This enigmatic character named Melchizedek, it's pronounced a bunch of different ways. Melchizedek, the king of Salem. And the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram, at the valley of Shaveh, that is the valley of the kings, which is a location we know about. Went out to meet Abraham after this whole rescue story that we just talked about. Then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of the Most High God. And he blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he, Abram, gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth of all. And that's it. That's Melchizedek's entire story. But it's interesting. This king with this crazy name who shows up for 3 verses in Genesis is so well known that the automatic spell checking software in Word recognizes his name and did not mark it as unknown when I was writing this. That actually surprised me. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, to whom Abraham gives a tenth. And this is actually where the concept of tithing starts. This idea of giving 10% of your income back to God or to the church. It's usually attributed to Jacob later in Genesis, and for good reason. But this is the actual first occurrence here in Genesis. But, who is this person? This person who shows up for 3 verses and vanishes. He's named as a priest of the Most High God, or in other words, God, the same God that called Abraham. And as for his name itself, our reading in Hebrews did explain what it means, but just for a little more clarity, Melech is the Hebrew word for king. And Zedek is the Hebrew word for righteousness or a righteous person. And so when you put it together, we have Melchizedek, the king of righteousness or the righteous king. And then there's Salem. And no, this is not the town just down the road from us, not the church that we interact with all the time down there. And it's not that village on the East Coast where a literal psychotic group frenzy, got a bunch of people killed for witchcraft. Many of them were men, by the way, just saying. But it's neither of those things. This is the original Salem. And the name matters. It matters a lot. There's a word in Hebrew, shalom, but it's easier to hear the similarity in the Arabic version of this word, which is salam. The similarity to Salem, which the Hebrew speakers would have pronounced as Salem. So shalom, salam, salem. These are all the same word, and they mean peace. So here we have Melchizedek, the king of righteousness in the city of peace, or the righteous king of the city of peace, to whom Abram gives the tithe, the first tithe on record. And here's where it gets really interesting, at least to me, because I love words. But because Salem is not just another city among the hundreds of city-states that come and go from that area of the world in history. Salem, at some point between Genesis and 2 Samuel, Salem gets a prefix added to its name. The prefix is yeru, which means flowing, as in water flowing. So Salem, by David's time in 2 Samuel, is now known, as it will be known from then until this very day, by the name Salem. It's the king of righteousness. Back in Genesis, some 3,000 years before Jesus was born, this priest of the Most High God, to whom Abraham gives the first tithe, he's the king of Jerusalem. Now put all of this together. The meaning of the Hebrew words that go into Jerusalem, Yaru, Salam, you get the city of flowing peace. I want you to just hold that image in your mind for a second. Peace, like water, flowing down from this shining city on top of a hill. It's the highest hill around. That's why it's called Mount Zion, which I believe is just another version of the word salam, but I did not fact check that, so don't quote me on it. But just keep this image in your mind for a second. Peace flowing like a river from this city on the hill. Now, that image is not a coincidence. Names do have meanings just intrinsically. It's why we name things. It's why we go about assigning identity and belonging to something, because the act of naming in itself is a powerful thing. And people in the ancient world, if you read their literature, it's pretty clear they were even more aware of the power in names than we are today. And so the images and the concepts that spring to mind from these literal meanings of the ancient names is often intentional. Someone meant for us to get that image, understand that concept, or feel that emotion. And this is one of the many reasons that you do miss a lot of the meaning in the Bible if you only read translations, if you do not know Hebrew and Greek. And I'm sorry, I know there's a certain difficulty, a certain learning curve here, but that's just the truth. A lot of the deep and profound beauty in the Bible is its wordplay, and wordplay just can't be translated. Jerusalem, it's a city of flowing peace, whose king is the king of righteousness. There are these themes that run through the Bible, and the wordplay has a lot to do with it. They are some of the most incredible things about the Bible, these themes, these patterns that just keep going and building on themselves, unbroken, all the way through this collection of totally separate written works that we call the Bible. These themes are what unite this collection of separate documents into a single book. And they are why I had us read passages that run through the Bible today, all about the same theme, the King of righteousness in the city of flowing peace, God's chosen King in God's chosen city. Now, obviously, because it's been in the news a lot these days, there's a lot of real stuff going on in the real Jerusalem right now. And there are many ways in which it does not seem to be a city of peace. It seems oftentimes more like a city of contention, of hostility, outright violence. The kings of Jerusalem, whatever they call themselves today, may not be righteous. I really don't know. But one of the other great things about the Bible is how many layers there are to it. It's one of the great things about literature in general, one of the things that makes all written works, particularly narrative written works, so powerful. And in the Bible, it's particularly true. There are historical layers to these stories, and then there are the layers that go beyond history. And just to be clear, this is not a new idea. This is not some modern concept that was invented in the modern age to discredit the historicity of the Bible or something like that. This is actually what theologians, what religious scholars, what people who studied the Bible have been saying since Jesus' time. Christian theology has always embraced the idea that there are both literal and allegorical meanings to every single part of the Bible. Yeah, including Genesis chapter 1, including the Gospels, including Revelation, just to name the most contentious parts. You know, there is a historical David in 2 Samuel who laid siege to a historical city, climbed up a waterway, took the city, and turned it into the capital of his kingdom. As someone who studied history, I see no reason not to believe that happened, more or less as it's written. But then there's also what David represents, what he comes to represent in the stories written after he lived, and what his city represents, even back in Genesis. The righteous king, the servant of the Most High God, the true priest in the city of peace. And what these layers allow us to do is they allow us to talk about real problems in the real world without losing the symbols or losing the lessons that those symbols were created to teach us. You know, when the writers of the later books in the Bible, including the entire New Testament, when they talk about David and Jerusalem, they are talking about the symbol, except the parts in the gospel where they're literally talking about Jerusalem, but those are pretty obvious. Anyway, they're talking about the symbol, the idea of God's justice and truth prevailing despite all odds, that God is the source of righteousness and peace, and that these things will prevail in the end. The reading from Hebrews today, which I know is long and complicated, and it needs a lot more of an explanation than I have time for this morning. That sermon is on the agenda in the future, we'll see. But this morning, just know what this passage means at its core. It means that these prior kings of righteousness, like Melchizedek, and though he's not mentioned in Hebrews, David too, these are just stand-ins for the ultimate righteous king, the one true high priest who is Jesus. The passages from Hebrews today, to boil it all the way down and frankly do it injustice, but ultimately it is a statement about how there is no legitimate human mediator between us and God, that Jesus is the true Melchizedek, the true righteous king, our direct connection to God forever. And here in the book of Hebrews, the Saga of Salem, as I have called it in my sermon title, it really starts to come together, at least for us Christians. In the historical reality, Jerusalem is a city that has been besieged over and over again. wars and famine and disease. The city has been wiped out and rebuilt at least 3 times in history, and yet it still stands as a symbol for peace and for righteousness. The righteous human kings fail over and over again. David failed over and over again, and yet the righteousness that they stand for and the God that they witness to remain. The city on the hill remains on the hill despite the 3+ times it has essentially been wiped off that hill. And I think it is exactly that contradiction between the historical reality and the symbol that gives the symbol its greatest power, because the city of peace endures. The King of righteousness stands tall in his city on the hill. These things endure through literally everything that the world has to throw at them, every reason we have to give up hope. The symbol endures. It motivates, it gives hope, and it inspires from Genesis to Revelation. Revelation 21. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people." But I saw no temple in the city, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. And he showed me a pure river of water, the water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its streets and on either side of the river was the tree of life. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it. Then he who sat on the throne, that is Jesus, said, "Behold, I make all things new. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, but the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, adulterers, and all liars shall have their part in the lake of fire, which is the second death." Now, this is my abbreviation, great abbreviation, of the 2 chapters that end the book of Revelation. They're the chapters that end the Bible in the form that it has had for the last 1,500 years. And I hope you see all the symbolism repeating here. The kings and thrones and city and water flowing. That is living water. But I actually quoted it a bit out of order. And if you read it for yourself, you'll see that the last part I read, the "Behold, I make all things new," and particularly that nice list of sins, which, by the way, are the sins that every society throughout history has agreed are sinful. But that part actually comes at the beginning of the first of these 2 chapters, not at the end. And I put it at the end today for a reason. I put it there to bring us back here at the end to Genesis. Back to these 2 kings in Genesis chapter 14. 2 kings, like the 2 trees in the creation story in Eden, even further back in Genesis. In Eden, there's the tree of life, which reappears here in Revelation, in the New Jerusalem. And there's also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree that Adam and Eve chose, the wrong tree. The other tree, that does not reappear in the New Jerusalem. The other tree, like the other king in Genesis 14, the king of Sodom, whom Abraham not only does not pay a tithe to, but Abraham will not even take payment from him. Because in the great symbolic tapestry that is the Bible, Sodom is Jerusalem's opposite. It's a symbol so illustrated so simply and beautifully in this forgotten story in Genesis 14. Sodom is those things that will not make it into the New Jerusalem, those things that wise men like Abraham will not allow to have any power over them. And this is where we will end today, on this reminder that there is a choice here, that there is always the ever-present choice from Genesis to Revelation, 2 trees, 2 cities, 2 kings. The ever-present choice between good and evil, and yes, the line can get blurry from time to time. I think this upcoming election is unfortunately a perfect example of how blurry the line between right and wrong can be. But I think more than anything else, the times like this cut to the heart of what really matters in the end, which is the choice itself. Because it's not actually about being right or wrong. We're human. We will never always get it right. Righteousness is about choosing to pursue righteousness, to do things for the right reasons, rather than just go along with what's wrong. It is harder, notice, it is harder to give 10% to the King of Salem than it is to take money from the King of Sodom. But which does Abraham do? Now, about your choices, anything that you choose to do or to support, can you say inside your deepest self, in that place that only God will ever see, can you say with complete sincerity that you have thoroughly examined all sides of the matter and to the best of your ability, and that you are making your choice in honest pursuit of right and nothing else? That you are not just following the path of least resistance or being carried along with everyone else, that you have no motive but truth, justice, and peace? Can you say that you are not allowing any evil thing a foothold in your life, in your decisions? It's just something to ponder now. As we turn to our next song, The Sanctuary, a reminder that the sanctuary was on that hill, Zion Hill. The song is about making ourselves into that sanctuary. It is in the little hymnal, The Faith We Sing. It's number 2164.